When LA Noire was first announced, it was supposed to change gaming forever, but as we all know, that's not exactly how things turned out. While it won over most critics, players weren't quite as enamored with it, and since its release, the title has become something of a punchline within the gaming community.
You fuck young boys, Valdez.
All it takes is a quick YouTube search to see that countless Let's Players and streamers have series that are primarily dedicated to ripping into LA Noire and shining light on all its faults. And that's a damn shame because Team Bondi's take on the hard-boiled detective genre doesn't get nearly enough credit for all the things it does right. What's up guys, Dusty here, aka the Half-Baked Gamer, aka the dude you're currently watching. If you enjoy this video, then why don't you leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Or don't, don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, let's go ahead and get back to the good stuff. Now, while I do love LA Noire, I'm not blind to its flaws, the most glaring one in my opinion being the combat. The nicest thing I can say about it is that it's functional. Headshots are a one-shot kill, so at least it's got that going for it. But yeah, it's pretty mediocre. Aiming feels really stiff, and the same can be said about the cover system. Enemies also never really push or flank you, so your best course of action is usually just to play a slow-ass version of whack-a-mole with them. I get that Team Bondi was going for a more grounded and realistic approach, so the shootout shouldn't be as explosive as they would in something like Max Payne, but they didn't need to make it quite this bland. When catching a bad guy with a shotgun blast to the chest doesn't even feel that satisfying, you're doing something wrong. The lack of side content likely didn't do it any favors when it came to winning players over either. Grand Theft Auto 4 is probably the most polarizing entry in its series, and the most common complaint was that it simply didn't offer the player enough to do outside the main missions. However, compared to LA Noire, GTA 4 might as well have been The Witcher 3. Literally, the only side activities here are the occasional street crime which you can choose to respond to, and oddly enough, stealing unique vehicles found throughout the map. Most of the street crimes end up being pretty forgettable too, as none of them feature any detective work, which is kind of the game's main selling point. I've seen rumors that the game was originally supposed to feature more side content, but that these ideas ended up being scrapped during the game's troubled development, but I'm not sure how much I actually buy that. See, several members of Team Bondi had jumped ship from Team Soho, the studio responsible for 2002's cult classic The Getaway, including founder Brendan McNamara, who served as the creative director for both titles. And The Getaway had featured what was at the time a vast, painstaking recreation of London, but unlike GTA 3 or Vice City, it didn't fill its virtual streets with side missions or collectibles, instead opting to use its sandbox simply as a backdrop for its narrative. So I wouldn't be shocked to learn that publisher Rockstar really had to push for what few side activities we did end up with here in LA Noire. Now, I'm someone who considers Mafia 2 one of their favorite games, so I personally don't mind the lack of extra content, but I'm willing to admit I'm in the minority on this one. And the lack of side content really points to the larger issue at hand. LA Noire is actually an adventure game masquerading as your typical Rockstar experience. When most people think of Rockstar, they think of stuff like Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, and Bully. All three of those games offer variations of a similar formula. Or as people often put it, Red Dead is GTA in the Wild West, while Bully is GTA in the schoolyard. And on the surface, LA Noire appears to follow that trend, but it quickly becomes apparent that most of your time is actually spent hunting down key items and navigating dialogue trees. Having played through Snatcher recently, LA Noire reminds me a lot more of that than it does any of Rockstar's own games. Honestly, the whole game could have been built around a point-and-click or visual novel type of interface, and it still would have completely worked, assuming you're into those types of games. However, if you're not, and you went into LA Noire simply expecting it to be GTA in the 1940s, then it's not that difficult to see why it ended up disappointed. I mean, you can't even use your weapon unless you're in a section where the game deems it to be appropriate. Within the context of LA Noire, this makes perfect sense, but to a fan base that was used to blowing off steam with violent 5-star rampages, it was always going to be a little jarring. And I'm fully aware that being a giant love letter to detective movies from the so-called golden age of Hollywood means LA Noire naturally has far more of a limited appeal these days than something like Telltale's The Walking Dead. After all, whether or not an adventure game clicks for you is primarily going to come down to how much you connect with the setting and the writing, and it's not like there's been a resurgence of classic film noir over the past few years. However, as a giant film nerd who will sing the praises of stuff like Out of the Past to anybody who's willing to listen to me, I can't get enough of this shit. All of the game's issues just fade into the background for me because LA Noire is a vibe. Where else can I turn on a black and white mode and cruise around California in the 40s like I'm Sam Spade in the Maltese Falcon? Even taking the time period out of it, the detective genre isn't one that's often represented in gaming, aside from the Sherlock Holmes series and a bunch of CSI tie-in games that most people under 60 have never heard of. So if you've got an itch to investigate crime scenes, track down suspects, and get information out of uncooperative witnesses, then this is easily one of your better options. And while the main storyline is set in stone, individual cases do have branching paths depending on what order you decide to complete your objectives and how effective you are at questioning witnesses, so there is incentive to go back and replay them, and even intentionally mess things up at times, just to see how things could play out differently. And at the risk of sounding even more like a pretentious asshole, back when LA Noire first released, it was such a novelty to play a game that felt like it was actually made for adults. It took most developers a long time to realize that the industry could move past its origins as a childish hobby. Even when they did attempt to create something more mature, they usually still found themselves falling back into familiar traps. Just look at the OG God of War games. Kratos is supposed to be this tragic figure who is seeking revenge on the gods for tricking him into murdering his own wife and daughter. That's some pretty dark shit. And there's nothing about this premise that really indicates a need for over-the-top sex minigames, but that didn't stop Santa Monica Studio. Even the series director at the time found himself wondering what the point of these scenes actually were by the time the third game came along, no pun intended. But let's be honest, they were included because the rule of fun won out. LA Noire, on the other hand, was at the forefront of a movement in gaming that placed narrative above all else. It fully commits to its tone and never betrays it just to provide the player with cheap gratification. That's not to say the game's completely humorless. In fact, at times it can be absolutely hilarious.
So they loaded up their car and drove off, tooting and hollering and yelling obscenities at me in Mexican.
You speak Spanish, sir?
No, I do not.
But it's mainly character-based comedy instead of the wacky and zany approach most game writers usually opt for.
If I killed every wife to serve me papers, I'd be a mass murderer.
Are you being flippant, young man?
No, ma'am.
Of course, you can't talk about LA Noire without bringing up its motion scan technology, which was used to capture the performances. Despite the ridicule it's received over the years, I do think that the tech holds up for the most part. It's great at picking up little details that make the performances far more lifelike than almost any other game from that era. However, it's also obvious that most of the actors were directed to really ham it up when it was time for questioning. I don't know how else you could explain an actor giving a perfectly fine performance one moment, only to turn around and do ridiculous shit like this the next. Now, I get where the developers were coming from, because a large amount of the gameplay does revolve around reading facial cues to determine whether a character is lying or telling the truth, and if those cues are too subtle, then you risk frustrating a lot of your players. However, LA Noire usually leans a bit too far in the other direction, which resulted in a lot of memeable material. Not helping matters is the fact that when you're questioning someone, the camera will hold on these goofy-ass expressions until the player makes their decision. Now, the point of this video isn't to convince you that you need to like LA Noire. If you tried it and you hated it, that's perfectly fine by me. Every game does not need to be for everybody. However, just because you don't like something doesn't mean you can't respect it. And with the way that AAA games have become increasingly homogenized over the past decade, LA Noire definitely deserves a little more respect. Because the industry is in a far better place when publishers and developers are taking risks and games like it are being made.